The Goblin of Zaragoza, a Paranormal Mystery. Chapter 1. The Laughter Begins. The crisp autumn air of Zaragoza carried a hint of change as September 1934 dawned over the ancient Spanish city. Narrow cobblestone streets wound between weathered stone buildings, their facades telling silent stories of centuries past. On Gascon de Gautour Street, an unremarkable apartment building stood quietly, its residents stirring to life as golden sunlight crept over terracotta rooftop. In a modest second-floor apartment, Pascuala Alcocer moved quietly through the kitchen, her calloused hands expertly preparing breakfast for the Palazon family. At 19, she carried herself with a maturity beyond her years, dark eyes watchful as she navigated the cramped space. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the yeasty scent of warm bread, a comforting ritual that belied the extraordinary events about to unfold. Señora Palazon entered, eyeing the sash of her faded housecoat. "Gracias, Pascuala," she murmured, accepting a steaming cup. Two women shared a moment of companionable silence, broken only by the distant tolling of church bells and the gentle clatter of cups against saucers. Then, they heard it. A low chuckle, barely audible at first, seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Pascuala froze, the coffee pot hovering uncertainly above Señora Palazon's cup. The laughter grew louder, taking on an unsettling timbre that sent chills down their spines. "Dios mío," Señora Palazon whispered, face paling. "What is that?" Pascuala set the pot down with trembling hands. I don't know, Señora." The laughter swelled, filling the kitchen with its eerie presence. It was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It simply was, and its very existence defied rational explanation. Señor Palazon burst into the room, his shirt half buttoned. "What's going on? Who's making that noise?" But as they stood there, family and their maid united in confusion and growing fear. They knew. No one in that room was laughing. Sound came from everywhere and nowhere, bantam mirth that mocked their bewilderment. As suddenly as it began, the laughter ceased. The abrupt silence felt oppressive, broken only by their ragged breathing. They exchanged uneasy glances, each seeing their own shock and disbelief mirrored in the other's eyes. It must have been the neighbors," Señor Palazon said, voice lacking conviction. "Or perhaps a radio. Yes, that's it. Someone's radio is malfunctioning." Pascuala nodded, desperate to cling to any rational explanation. But a chill lingered in her bones, a premonition of the terror that was only beginning to unfold. Throughout the day, an air of unease settled over the building. Neighbors whispered in hallways, their eyes darting nervously. Had they heard it too? Was it just a shared delusion, a momentary madness? No one wanted to speak of it directly, as if giving voice to the experience might somehow make it more real. As twilight painted the sky in hues of lavender and gold, Pascuala stood at the kitchen window, absently drying a plate. The events of the morning felt like a half-remembered dream, and she had almost convinced herself that, Pascuala. The plate slipped from her fingers, shattering on the tiled floor. That voice. It came from the stove, impossibly close. It was no longer laughing. Instead, it spoke her name with an intimacy that made her skin crawl. "Pascuala," it repeated, a sing-song lilt to its tone. "Sweet Pascuala, do you hear me?" She backed away, her heart thundering in her chest. Who's there?" she managed to stammer. A giggle, high and unnatural, echoed through the kitchen. "Who indeed? Shall we play a game, Pascuala? I so love games." The young maid's scream brought the Palazons running. They found her pressed against the far wall, eyes wide with terror, pointing a shaking finger at the innocuous stove. "It spoke to me," she whispered. "Dios mío, it knows my name." As the Palazon family tried to comfort the distraught Pascuala, none of them noticed the shadowy figure watching from across the street. The observer's lips curled into a satisfied smile. So it begins, they thought, melting into the gathering darkness. The Goblin of Zaragoza had made its debut, and the stage was set for a performance that would captivate the world. Chapter 2. The Voice Emerges. In the days that followed, an atmosphere of dread settled over the apartment building on Gascon de Gautour Street. The laughter, once an isolated incident, became a near-constant companion to the residents. It echoed through walls, emanated from drain pipes, and seemed to follow Pascuala Alcocer wherever she went. Señora Palazon found the young maid huddled in a corner of the pantry one morning, face streaked with tears. "It won't leave me alone," Pasquale whispered, her voice hoarse. Keeps calling my name, taunting me. Am I going mad, Signora? The older woman knelt beside her, wrapping a comforting arm around Pasquale's trembling shoulders. No, Nina, we all hear it. You're not alone in this. But as the days wore on, it became clear that while the entire building experienced the haunting, Pasquale remained the focus of the entity's attention. The voice, when it deigned to speak rather than laugh, called to her with unsettling familiarity. Pasquale, mi amor, would croon, the words slithering from the kitchen stove like tendrils of smoke. Why do you ignore me? We could have such fun together. Palazon family watched helplessly as their once cheerful maid withdrew into herself, dark circles forming under her eyes from sleepless nights. Signor Palazon, a practical man who prided himself on his rationality, found himself grasping at straws for an explanation. Perhaps it's some sort of acoustic phenomenon, he mused one evening, pacing the living room, a trick of architecture that carries sound in strange ways. His wife shot him a withering look. And I suppose this acoustic phenomenon just happens to know Pasquale's name? Speak in full sentences? Miguel, please. You must face the fact that something unnatural is happening here. Outside, a crowd had begun to gather. News of the strange occurrences spread through Zaragoza like wildfire, drawing the curious and the skeptical alike. They stood on the street, necks craned as if expecting to see some visible manifestation of the haunting. Among them was Javier Ruiz, a young reporter for the local newspaper. He watched the building with keen interest, scribbling notes in a dog-eared pad. This was the story that could make his career, and he was determined to uncover the truth behind the so-called Goblin of Zaragoza. As twilight deepened into night, the voice grew bolder. No longer confined itself to whispers and giggles, but began to speak loudly enough for those gathered outside to hear. Come closer, it beckoned, its tone shifting from childlike to something altogether more sinister. Don't you want to see? Don't you want to know? A collective shudder ran through the crowd. Some crossed themselves, muttering prayers under their breath. Others pressed closer, morbid fascination overriding their fear. Inside the Palazon apartment, Pasquale sat at the kitchen table, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Signora Palazon busied herself making tea, the familiar ritual providing a thin veneer of normalcy. Perhaps, Signora Palazon said gently, setting a steaming cup before the girl, it would be best if you went to stay with your family for a while. Just until this passes. Pasquale looked up, her eyes hollow. And if it follows me? If I bring this thing to my parents' home? No, Signora, I cannot risk it. Whatever this is, it has chosen me, I must face it. As if in response to her declaration, the voice spoke again, its words dripping with malice. Wise choice, sweet Pasquale. We have so much to discuss, you and I, so many secrets to share. Signora Palazon gasped, the teapot slipping from her grasp and shattering on the floor. For the first time, she had heard the voice with her own ears, and the reality of their situation, him crashing down upon. Out on the street, the crowd had grown larger still. Windows in neighboring buildings blazed with light, as more and more people were drawn to the unfolding drama. Javier Ruiz pushed his way to the front, his journalistic instincts on fire. Signor Palazon, he called out, spotting the man peering anxiously from a second-floor window. Is it true? Is there really a voice speaking from within your home? Before Signor Palazon could respond, a sound like rolling thunder filled the air. The voice, now loud enough to be heard clearly by all, spoke with chilling clarity. Oh yes, it's all true, it said, a note of gleeful malice in its tone. Believe your eyes, believe your ears. The Goblin of Zaragoza is here, and the show is just beginning. Collective gasp rose from the crowd. Javier's pencil flew across his notepad, recording every word. In that moment, as fear and excitement rippled through the gathered onlookers, he knew this was no longer a local curiosity. The eyes of the world would soon turn to Zaragoza, drawn by the mystery of the unearthly voice, seemed to defy all rational explanation. Inside, Pasquale Alcocer closed her eyes, a single tear tracing its way down her cheek. Whatever force had invaded their lives, whatever entity had chosen to fixate upon her, she knew with grim certainty their ordeal was far from over. The voice had emerged, and with it, a terror that would grip not just a single apartment, but an entire city, leaving in its wake a mystery that would endure for generations to come. Chapter 3. Local authorities intervene. The next morning dawned gray and oppressive, as if the very sky hung heavy with the weight of the previous night's events. A light drizzle fell, beating on the hats and coats of the small crowd that still lingered on Gascon de Godor Street, their eyes fixed on the now infamous apartment building. At precisely 9 o'clock, a police car pulled up, its arrival sending a ripple of excitement through the onlookers. 2 officers stepped out, their faces set in masks of professional detachment. Inspector Carlos Morales, a veteran of the Zaragoza police force, surveyed the scene with narrowed eyes. Beside him, young Officer Ana Delgado shifted nervously. First major case already promising to be one for the history book. "Clear the area," Morales barked, his authoritative tone brooking no argument. As the crowd reluctantly dispersed, he turned to his partner. "Remember, Delgado, we approach this scientifically. There's a rational explanation for everything." Anna nodded, but her hands strayed to the crucifix at her neck. Stories of the voice had spread like wildfire, and despite her training, a tendril of doubt curled in her stomach. They made their way up the narrow staircase, old wood creaking beneath their feet. Signor Palazon met them at the door, his face haggard from lack of sleep. "Thank you for coming, Inspector," he said, ushering them inside. "I apologize for the disturbance, but we didn't know what else to do." Morales nodded curtly. "Start from the beginning, Signor. Leave nothing out." As Palazon recounted the events of the past few days, Anna's eyes darted around the apartment. It was utterly ordinary, worn but well-kept furniture, family photos on the walls, the lingering scent of last night's dinner. Nothing to suggest the supernatural drama that had allegedly unfolded within these walls. "And the voice," Morales pressed, his tone skeptical. "You say it speaks primarily to your maid? Where is she now?" As if on cue, a door opened, and Pasquala emerged. The young woman looked pale and drawn, dark circles under her eyes testament to sleepless nights. She gave a small curtsy to the officers, her gaze downcast. "Señorita Alcocer," Morales began, his voice softening slightly. "Can you tell us?" A peal of laughter interrupted him, high and mocking. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Anna stiffened, her hand moving instinctively to her holstered weapon. "Cowards," a voice sneered, its source impossible to pinpoint. "You've called the police. Do you think they can help you?" Morales spun around, his composure cracking. "Who's there? Show yourself." More laughter, cruel and taunting. "Oh, Inspector, so brave, so foolish. Shall we play a game? I do so love games." For a long moment, silence reigned. Then, with a suddenness that made them all jump, the voice spoke again, this time from the direction of the kitchen stove. "I spy with my little eye," sing-songed, "a man who wears a brave face, but whose hands shake when no one is looking. Who could that be, I wonder?" Morales's face drained of color. He had indeed been hiding his trembling hands in his pocket, a nervous habit he thought no one had noticed. Anna stepped forward, her voice quavering slightly. "In the name of the law, identify yourself." "The law?" Voice practically purred. "Sweet child, your laws mean nothing to me. I am beyond your petty human constraint." Signor Palazon slumped into a chair, head in his hand. "You see, Inspector? This is what we've been dealing with. What are we to do?" Morales stood frozen, his worldview crumbling around him. Everything in his training, everything he believed, told him this was impossible. "And yet, we need to conduct a thorough search of the premises," he managed at last, struggling to regain his professional demeanor. "Officer Delgado, check for any hidden speakers or recording devices. Signor Palazon, I'll need to question each member of your household individually." As Anna began her search, meticulously checking every nook and cranny of the apartment, Morales interviewed the family one by one. Each told the same story: the laughter, the voice, its fixation on Pasquala. The consistency of their accounts only deepened the mystery. Hours passed. The search yielded nothing. No hidden speakers, no secret passages, nothing that could explain the phenomena they had all witnessed. As the autumn day waned into evening, Morales stood by the window, watching as an even larger crowd gathered below. News cameras had arrived, their lights harsh in the gathering dusk. "What do we tell them?" Anna asked quietly, coming to stand beside him. Morales sighed heavily. "The truth, Delgado, that our investigation is ongoing, and that we urge the public to remain calm." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were hollow. How could he ask for calm when his own foundations had been so thoroughly shaken? As if sensing his thoughts, the voice spoke once more, soft and insinuating. Poor Inspector. So lost, so confused. Don't worry, this is only the beginning. We have so much more to show you. Morales straightened his shoulders, a mixture of fear and determination settling over him like a mantle. Whatever this was, hoax, mass delusion, or something far more sinister, he would get to the bottom of it. The Goblin of Zaragoza had made a formidable enemy, and Carlos Morales was not a man to back down from a challenge. As he and Ana left the building, pushing through the throng of reporters and onlookers, one thing was abundantly clear. Quiet life of Gascon de Gautour Street was over. A mystery had taken root in the heart of Zaragoza, and its tendrils were spreading, drawing in the curious, the skeptical, and the fearful alike. The stage was set for a drama that would captivate not just a city, but soon, the entire world. Chapter 4. The investigation deepened. As dawn broke over Zaragoza the following day, the city buzzed with an electric tension. News of the haunting had spread like wildfire, and Gascon de Gautour Street had become the epicenter of a growing storm of speculation and fear. Dr. Joaquin Jimen Oriera stepped out of his car, keen eyes taking in the scene. A renowned psychiatrist known for his skepticism of the paranormal, Oriera had been called in by Inspector Morales as a last resort. Police investigation had hit a wall, and they needed a fresh perspective. "Doctor, thank you for coming," Morales greeted him, the strain evident in his voice. Dark circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights spent poring over reports and witness statements. Oriera nodded briskly. "Let's get to work, shall we? I'd like to start by interviewing the maid, Pascuala Alcocer." Inside the Palazón apartment, Pascuala sat rigidly in a chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Dr. Oriera studied her intently, noting the young woman's pallor and the nervous twitch of her left eye. "Señorita Alcocer," he began, his tone gentle but probing, "tell me about the first time you heard the voice." As Pascuala recounted her experiences, Oriera listened intently, occasionally jotting notes in a small leather-bound notebook. His brow furrowed as she described the voice's fixation on her, its taunting familiarity. "And you're certain," pressed, "that you've never experienced anything like this before? No history of auditory hallucinations or vivid dreams?" Pascuala shook her head emphatically. "Never, doctor. I've always been of sound mind, until now at least," she added with a bitter laugh. Oriera leaned back, his mind racing. After a moment, he turned to Inspector Morales. "I'd like to conduct some tests. Is there a quiet room where I can work undisturbed?" As Oriera set up his equipment in a spare bedroom, a commotion outside drew Morales to the window. A team of workers had arrived carrying an assortment of tools and measuring devices. "Who authorized this?" Morales demanded, hurrying down to the street. A burly man in overalls stepped forward. "Name's Ramon Fuentes, Inspector. I'm a master mason. We've been hired by the city to examine the building structure. If there's any natural explanation for these phenomena, we'll find it." Morales nodded reluctantly. "Very well, but coordinate with my officers. I want to know about everything you find, no matter how insignificant it may seem." As the day wore on, the building became a hive of activity. Masons tapped at walls, plumbers snaked cameras through pipes, and electricians combed through every inch of wiring. Dr. Oriera emerged periodically from his makeshift laboratory, his face a mask of concentration. By late afternoon, the crowd had once again gathered outside, held at bay by a cordon of police officers. Among them, Javier Ruiz scribbled furiously in his notebook, his journalistic instincts on fire. Inside, Dr. Oriera called for a meeting with Inspector Morales and the Palazón family. His face was grave as he began to speak. "After extensive testing, I've developed a theory," announced. "Believe we're dealing with a case of unconscious ventriloquism." Collective gasp filled the room. Senora Palazón found her voice first. "Are you suggesting that Pascuala is doing this herself, without knowing it?" Oriera nodded. "It's a rare phenomenon, but not unheard of. Under extreme stress, the mind can sometimes manifest extraordinary abilities. In this case, I believe Pascuala is unknowingly projecting her voice, creating the illusion of a separate entity." Pascuala leapt to her feet, eyes flashing with anger and hurt. "No, I would never, I couldn't." But before she could finish, that chilling laugh filled the room once more. "Oh, doctor," a voice mocked, seeming to come from the very walls themselves. "How clever you think you are. Shall we put your theory to the test?" Everyone froze, their eyes darting to Pasquale. The young maid stood rigid, her mouth firmly closed as the voice continued to speak. "Perhaps the good doctor would like to explain how I can speak while sweet Pasquale remains silent? Or better yet," the voice shifted, now emanating from the kitchen. "Why don't you measure the chimney, doctor? I think you'll find it's exactly 6 inches in diameter. Go on, check. I'll wait." Ramon Fuentes, who had joined the group, looked at Morales questioningly. At the inspector's nod, he retrieved a measuring tape and approached the stove. With shaking hands, he extended the tape up the chimney. "Dios mío," whispered, his face pale. It's exactly 6 inches." Dr. Oriera slumped into a chair, his theory crumbling before his eyes. "Impossible," he muttered. "Simply impossible." As the implications of what they had just witnessed sank in, a heavy silence fell over the room. Whatever was haunting this building, whatever force had inserted itself into their lives, was beyond their current understanding. The investigation had deepened, but instead of answers, they had only found more questions. Outside, oblivious to the drama unfolding within, the crowd continued to grow. News vans jostled for position, their satellite dishes reaching skyward like metallic flowers straining for the sun. Javier Ruiz, sensing a shift in the air, pushed his way to the front. "Inspector Morales," called out, spotting the policeman through a window. "Any comments on the investigation? What can you tell us about the voice?" Morales regarded the young reporter warily. After a moment's hesitation, he opened the window. "The investigation is ongoing," he announced, his voice carrying to the hushed crowd. "We ask for patience as we work to understand these unprecedented events." As night fell once again on Gascon de Gotor Street, the city of Zaragoza held its collective breath. The goblin had spoken, had demonstrated knowledge that defied explanation, and in doing so it had shattered the boundaries between the known and the unknown, between the rational and the inexplicable. In the Palazzone's kitchen, Pasquale stood alone, her hand resting on the cool metal of the stove. "What are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What do you want from me?" The voice, when it came, was soft, almost tender. "Oh, Pasquale, we're just getting started. The real fun is yet to come." And with those ominous words hanging in the air, the stage was set for the next act in a drama that would soon captivate not just a city, but the entire world. Chapter 5: The Chimney Incident. The following days brought little respite for the residents of Gascon de Gotor Street. Voice, emboldened by its triumph over Dr. Oriera's theories, grew more frequent and more audacious in its manifestations. It no longer confined itself to the kitchen but seemed to roam freely throughout the Palazzone apartment, its taunting laughter and cryptic comments a constant source of terror for the family and their beleaguered maid. Pasquale Alcocer moved through the apartment like a ghost, her once vibrant spirit dimmed by the relentless psychological assault. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands shook as she went about her duties. The voice's fixation on her had not waned, if anything, it had intensified. "Sweet Pasquale," prune, its tone a mockery of tenderness. "Why so glum? Don't you enjoy our little chats?" On this particular morning, a team of investigators had once again descended upon the building. Led by Professor Eduardo Ruiz, a respected parapsychologist from the University of Madrid, they came armed with an array of sophisticated equipment designed to detect any anomalies in electromagnetic fields, temperature fluctuations, or sound waves. "We must approach this scientifically," Professor Ruiz instructed his team as they set up their gear. "Whatever is causing these phenomena, be it natural or otherwise, it must adhere to some form of measurable principle." Inspector Morales watched the proceedings with a mixture of hope and skepticism. After the failure of Dr. Oriera's theory, found himself increasingly open to explanations he would have dismissed out of hand just days ago. As the morning wore on, the investigators methodically worked their way through the apartment, their instruments humming and beeping. Pasquale hovered nervously in the background, jumping at every unexpected sound. It was just past noon when one of the researchers called out excitedly, "Professor, I'm getting some strange readings from the kitchen area. The team converged on the stove, their instruments suddenly alive with activity. Lights flashed, needles swung wildly, and a cacophony of beeps and whirs filled the air. And then, cutting through the mechanical noise, came that now familiar laugh. "Oh, how delightful," the voice said, its tone dripping with sarcasm. "The little humans and their little toys. Shall we give them something to really measure?" What happened next would be the subject of debate and speculation for years to come. The temperature in the kitchen plummeted, frost forming on the windows despite the warm autumn day outside. The lights flickered and died, plunging the room into an unnatural twilight. And from the stove, a wind began to howl, carrying with it the acrid scent of brimstone. "Run!" Professor Ruiz shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the otherworldly gale. Vapors swirled through the air, instruments sparked and smoked, and the very walls seemed to groan under some unseen pressure. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The lights flickered back to life, revealing a scene of chaos. Equipment lay scattered and broken across the floor, and the investigators huddled against the walls, their faces pale with shock. In the ensuing silence, the voice spoke once more, its tone now cold and imperious. "You seek to measure me? To quantify the unquantifiable? Very well. Here is a measurement for you." All eyes turned to the stove as the voice continued. "The chimney that rises from this hearth is exactly 6 inches in diameter. Runs straight up for 17 feet before bending at a precise 30-degree angle to the east. At that bend there's a small crack, no wider than a hair, caused by the settling of the building's foundation in the spring of 1921. Professor Ruiz, his scientific curiosity overriding his fear, approached the stove. "That's remarkably specific," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "But how can we verify such claims?" The voice chuckled, a sound devoid of mirth. "By all means, Professor. Verify to your heart's content. Tear down the walls if you must. But know this, with every secret you uncover, with every mystery you think you've solved, you only draw yourselves deeper into my web." As if on cue, Ramon Fuentes, the master mason who had been called back to assist with the investigation, entered the kitchen. His face was ashen, his hands shaking as he held up a set of blueprints. "It's all true," he whispered. "Every detail. I've checked the original building plans, and then we opened up the wall to be sure." He swallowed hard before continuing. "Chimney dimensions, the angle, even the crack. It's all exactly as the voice said." A heavy silence fell over the room as the implications sank in. Whatever force they were dealing with, it possessed knowledge that went beyond mere trickery or illusion. It knew things that no living person could possibly know. Details hidden within the very bones of the building. Pasquala, who had been watching the scene unfold with growing horror, suddenly crumpled to the floor, her nerves finally giving way under the strain. As Senora Palazon rushed to her side, the young maid's eyes rolled back, and she began to mutter incoherently. "It knows," she whimpered, her voice barely audible. "It sees everything. It's inside the walls, inside our heads. We can't escape it. We can't." As the others tended to Pascual, Inspector Morales pulled Professor Ruiz aside. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. "How do we fight something we can't even begin to understand?" Professor shook his head slowly, his earlier scientific confidence shattered. "I don't know, Inspector. In all my years of studying paranormal phenomena, I've never encountered anything like this. We're in uncharted territory now." Outside, a crowd that had become a constant presence on Gascon de Gautour Street sensed that something significant had occurred. A ripple of excitement passed through the onlookers as they pressed against the police barricades, straining for any glimpse or sound from the infamous building. Javier Ruiz, the young reporter who had been covering the story from the beginning, pushed his way to the front. He watched as shaken investigators emerged from the building, their faces pale and drawn. Something had changed, he realized. The story had just taken a dramatic turn. As night fell once again on Zaragoza, a palpable sense of unease settled over the city. The goblin had not just spoken. It had demonstrated knowledge and power, defied rational explanation. And in doing so, it had shattered the last vestiges of skepticism, forcing even the most ardent doubters to confront the possibility something truly supernatural taken root in their community. In the Palazon's apartment, now eerily quiet, After the day's tumultuous events, Pasquale lay in her narrow bed, staring unseeing at the ceiling. Voice for once was silent. But in that silence lay a promise, unspoken yet undeniable. This was far from over. The true test for Pasquale and for all of Zaragoza is yet to come. Chapter 6. International Spotlight. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when the first international news vans began to arrive in Zaragoza. Word of the Goblin had spread far beyond the borders of Spain, capturing the imagination of a world hungry for mystery and the unknown. In London, the venerable presses of the Times rolled to life, their front page dominated by a headline that would send shockwaves across Europe. Voice from Beyond, The Haunting of Zaragoza. The article, penned by seasoned correspondent William Hartley, painted a vivid picture of the events unfolding in the quiet Spanish city. Hartley's prose, at once measured and tinged with a sense of wonder, brought the story to life for readers across the globe. In a modest apartment on an unremarkable street, a drama is unfolding that challenges our very understanding of reality. A voice, by turns playful and menacing, has taken up residence in the home of the Palazon family. It speaks of things it cannot know, demonstrates powers that defy explanation, and has turned the life of a young maid named Pasquale Alcocer into a waking nightmare. As copies of the Times made their way across newsstands and breakfast tables, the story of the Zaragoza Goblin ignited the public imagination. Radio broadcasts crackled with updates and speculation, while telegraphs clattered ceaselessly, carrying requests for information from news outlets around the world. Back in Zaragoza, the sudden influx of international attention was both exhilarating and overwhelming. Mayor Antonio Fernandez found himself thrust into the global spotlight, his every word and action scrutinized by a voracious media. Zaragoza has always been a city of history and culture, he declared at a hastily arranged press conference. Beads of sweat visible on his brow despite the cool autumn air. We are committed to unraveling this mystery while ensuring the safety and well-being of all our citizens. But even as the mayor spoke of control and investigation, the reality on Gascon de Gotor Street told a different story. The once quiet thoroughfare had been transformed into a circus. Journalists, psychics, and curiosity seekers from around the world jostling for position. Javier Ruiz, the local reporter who had been covering the story from its inception, found himself both elated and dismayed by the turn of events. On one hand, his early reports had caught the eye of several international news agencies, potentially opening doors to a broader career. On the other, he watched with growing unease as the human element of the story, fear and confusion of the Palazon family, the haunted look in Pasquale's eyes, was increasingly overshadowed by sensationalism and speculation. As the day wore on, a kaleidoscope of characters descended upon the street. Self-proclaimed psychics waved crystals and muttered incantations, their dramatic gestures drawing eye rolls from the more skeptical onlookers. Amateur ghost hunters clutched homemade EMF detectors, their excited chatter adding to the cacophony. Amid the chaos, Inspector Morales struggled to maintain order. His men formed a human barricade around the apartment building, their faces strained as they held back the surging crowd. "This is a crime scene, not a carnival," Morales bellowed, his patience wearing thin. But even as he spoke, a nagging voice in the back of his mind whispered a troubling question. Was this a crime scene? What laws could possibly apply to an entity that seemed to exist beyond the realm of human understanding? Inside the apartment, the Palazon family huddled together in the living room, their faces drawn and pale. The constant attention had taken its toll, turning their home into a fishbowl, their every move scrutinized by the outside world. Pasquale sat apart from the others, her gaze fixed on the kitchen door. The voice had been uncharacteristically quiet since the chimney incident. Far from providing relief, the silence only heightened her sense of dread. What was it planning? When would it speak again? As if in answer to her unspoken questions, a low chuckle emanated from the kitchen. The Palazons stiffened, their eyes wide with renewed fear. Pasquale rose slowly, drawn inexorably towards the sound. "Ah, sweet Pasquale," the voice purred, its tone dripping with false affection. "Did you miss me? I do apologize for my little absence, but I've been ever so busy. You see, we have guests." Collective gasp rose from outside, audible even through the closed windows. The voice had pitched itself to be heard not just within the apartment, by the crowd on the street below. "Welcome, one and all, to our little performance," it boomed, its volume increasing dramatically. "You've come from far and wide to witness the unexplainable, a peek behind the veil of reality. Well, allow me to give you what you came for." What followed was a display that would be recounted in newspapers and radio broadcasts around the world for weeks to come. The voice, now seeming to emanate from every corner of the building simultaneously, ran through a dizzying array of languages and accents, recited Shakespeare in perfect Elizabethan English, rattled off complex mathematical equations, and revealed intimate details about random members of the crowd, left them pale and shaking. As the demonstration reached its crescendo, the very fabric of reality seemed to warp. Those gathered on the street would later swear that the building itself had begun to ripple and distort, solid brick facade taking on the fluidity of water. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Profound silence fell over Gascon de Gautour Street, broken only by the soft sobs of those whose nerves had finally given way under the strain. In London, William Hartley sat at his desk in the Times office, his fingers hovering over the keys of his typewriter. How could he possibly convey the magnitude of what was unfolding in Zaragoza? How could mere words capture the sense of wonder and terror that had gripped the city? As he pondered these questions, a telegram arrived from his editor. "Hartley, stop. Return to Zaragoza immediately. Stop Times dedicating full coverage to Goblin story. Stop world watching. Stop, do not disappoint, stop." Hartley sighed, reaching for his coat. Story of the century was unfolding, and he was being called back to the eye of the storm. As he prepared for his journey, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to witness something that would change the world forever. Back in Zaragoza, as night fell once again on Gascon de Gautour Street, Pascuala Alcacer stood at her window, looking out at the sea of faces below. The voice had made its grand debut on the world stage, and in doing so had irrevocably altered the course of her life and the lives of everyone in Zaragoza. "What happens now?" she whispered. Half to herself and half to the presence she knew was always listening. The voice, when it came, was soft and intimate, meant for her ears alone. "Now, my dear, now the real fun begins." And with those ominous words hanging in the air, the stage was set for the next act in a drama that had captured the attention of the entire world. The Goblin of Zaragoza had made its presence known, and there would be no turning back. Chapter 7. Escalation and Evacuation. The days that followed the Goblin's international debut were a blur of activity and mounting tension. Zaragoza, once a quiet city known for its beautiful basilica and rich history, had been transformed into a hotbed of paranormal speculation and media frenzy. William Hartley, correspondent from the Times, found himself at the center of this whirlwind. His articles, which strove for objectivity even in the face of the inexplicable, had become must-read material for a global audience hungry for updates on the Zaragoza phenomenon. As Hartley made his way down Gascon de Gautour Street early one morning, notepad in hand, he was struck by the transformation of the neighborhood. What had once been a typical residential area now resembled nothing so much as a military encampment. Police barricades blocked off the street, while stern-faced officers patrolled the perimeter, their hands never far from their weapons. The apartment building itself had taken on an almost mythic quality. Its unremarkable facade seemed to loom larger than the surrounding structures, an illusion no doubt fueled by the knowledge of what transpired within its walls. Hartley noticed with a start that many of the neighboring buildings stood empty, their residents having fled the area as the Goblin's activities intensified. As he approached the police cordon, Hartley spotted a familiar face. Inspector Morales stood in deep conversation with a group of official-looking men in suits. The inspector's face was drawn, dark circles under his eyes testament to sleepless nights spent grappling with a case that defied all conventional law enforcement tactics. "Inspector Morales," Hartley called out, waving his press credentials. "A moment of your time, please." Morales turned, his expression a mixture of resignation and wariness. He excused himself from the group and approached the barricade. "Mr. Hartley," he said, his voice gruff, "I'm afraid I have no new information for you at this time. The investigation is ongoing and, He was cut off by a sudden commotion from within the building. Shouts of alarm rang out, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Morales spun on his heel, barking orders to his men as he rushed towards the entrance. Hartley, his journalistic instincts overriding caution, ducked under the barricade and followed close behind. As they burst into the building's foyer, the scene that greeted them was one of chaos. Palazón family huddled in a corner, their faces masks of terror. Señor Palazón stood protectively in front of his wife and children, but his trembling hands betrayed his fear. Pascuala was nowhere to be seen. Gone mad, Señora Palazón sobbed, her words barely coherent. The voice, it's threatening to kill us all. You must get us out of here. Before Morales could respond, that now familiar laugh echoed through the building, its tone darker and more menacing than ever before. Kill you? Voice mocked. Oh, my dear Señora, death would be far too simple, far too kind. No, I have much more interesting plans for you all. As if to underscore its words, a violent tremor shook the building. Cracks spider-webbed across the ceiling, and a fine shower of plaster dust rained down upon them. Morales didn't hesitate. Evacuate the building immediately, ordered, his voice cutting through the panic. Get everyone out now. As police officers rushed to comply, Hartley found himself swept up in the evacuation. He watched in stunned silence as the residents of the building were hurried out onto the street, many still in their nightclothes, clutching whatever possessions they had managed to grab. Amidst the chaos, Hartley spotted a small figure being half-carried, half-dragged from the building. It was Pascuala, her eyes wide and unfocused, her lips moving in a constant silent litany. As the last of the residents were brought to safety, Morales conferred quickly with his superiors. Decisions were made in haste, plans set in motion that would have seemed unthinkable just days before. Within hours, a cordon had been established around not just the building, but the entire block. Electrical and telephone lines were cut, severing the area's connection to the outside world. The National Guard arrived, their trucks rumbling down the narrow streets, adding to the sense of a city under siege. As night fell, Hartley found himself standing at the edge of the exclusion zone, watching as floodlights were set up to illuminate the now abandoned building. The Palazón family and the other evacuees had been whisked away to an undisclosed location, leaving behind a ghost town in the heart of Zaragoza. A young boy's voice cut through the eerie silence. Papa, I want to go home. Hartley turned to see Arturo Grijalba, the son of the building's owner, clinging to his father's hand. The boy's eyes were fixed on the apartment building, a mixture of longing and fear in his gaze. We can't go back yet, Arturo, Señor Grijalba said softly, his own voice heavy with emotion. It's not safe. As if in response to the boy's plea, the voice spoke once more, its words carried on the night air to all those gathered at the perimeter. Home? Said, a note of cruel amusement in its tone. Oh, little Arturo, don't you understand? This is home now. All of us. A collective shudder ran through the crowd. Arturo buried his face in his father's coat, muffling a sob. And in that moment, as fear and uncertainty hung heavy in the air, the true gravity of the situation became clear to all. The Goblin of Zaragoza was no longer content to be a local curiosity or even an international sensation. It had laid claim to the building, the street, perhaps to the very city itself, and in doing so it had crossed a line from which there could be no easy return. As Hartley scribbled furiously in his notebook, struggling to capture the gravity of the moment, he knew that the story he was witnessing and participating in had entered a new and dangerous phase. The evacuation marked a turning point, an escalation that would have far-reaching consequences not just for Zaragoza, but potentially for the world's understanding of the supernatural. The stage was set for a confrontation between the known and the unknown, between the rational world of human understanding and the chaotic realm of the inexplicable. And at the center of it all stood a simple apartment building on Gascon de Gotor Street, transformed by unseen forces into ground zero for a battle that would challenge the very foundations of reality. Chapter 8: Aftermath and Theories. The days following the dramatic evacuation of Gascon de Gotor Street unfolded in a haze of uncertainty and mounting tension. Zaragoza, a city that had prided itself on its rich history and cultural heritage, now found itself grappling with a present that defied all rational explanation. William Hartley stood at his makeshift desk in a hastily established press center poring over his notes. The evacuation had been front-page news around the world, and the demand for updates was insatiable. But as he stared at the jumble of facts, testimonies, and observations before him, Hartley found himself at a loss. How could he possibly distill the events of the past weeks into something coherent, let alone explicable? A tap on his shoulder roused him from his reverie. It was Javier Ruiz, a local reporter who had been covering the story from its inception. The young man's face was drawn, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "Any word from your sources inside the cordon?" Hartley asked, hopeful for any new information. Javier shook his head. "Nothing concrete. The National Guard has sealed off the entire area. Not even the police are allowed in without top-level clearance." As they spoke, a commotion near the entrance to the press center caught their attention. A group of men in suits was making its way through the crowded room, their purposeful stride and serious expressions marking them as officials of some kind. At their center walked a tall, distinguished-looking man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. Even without introduction, Hartley recognized him immediately. Dr. Alejandro Vega, Spain's foremost expert on paranormal phenomena and the newly appointed head of the government's task force on the Zaragoza incident. "Gentlemen," Dr. Vega addressed the assembled press, his voice carrying easily over the buzz of conversation. "I understand you have many questions. I'm here to provide what answers I can, though I must stress that much about this situation remains unknown." For the next hour, Dr. Vega outlined the current state of the investigation and the various theories being considered. His words were carefully chosen, scientific in tone, but Hartley could sense the underlying current of bewilderment. "And yes, dear. At present we are considering several possibilities," Vega explained. "These range from mass hysteria and elaborate hoax to previously unknown natural phenomena. And yes, we are also exploring the possibility of genuine paranormal activity." A ripple of excitement ran through the room at these words. It was the first time a government official had openly acknowledged the potential supernatural nature of the events. "But surely, Dr. Vega," one reporter called out, "evidence points to something beyond natural explanation. The voice's knowledge of hidden structural details, its apparent ability to manipulate physical objects." Vega held up a hand, his expression grave. "We must be cautious about jumping to conclusion. The human mind has a remarkable capacity for pattern recognition and meaning-making, even in the absence of concrete evidence. What seems inexplicable may simply be a phenomenon we don't yet understand." As the press conference continued, Hartley found his attention drawn to a small group huddled in a corner of the room. It was the Palazon family, looking lost and out of place amidst the bustle of journalists and officials. Pasquala stood slightly apart from them, gaze distant, as if listening to a voice only she could hear. Excusing himself from the main group, Hartley made his way over to them. Señor Palazon looked up as he approached, recognition flickering in his tired eyes. "Mr. Hartley," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They told you anything? When can we go home?" Hartley shook his head sadly. "I'm afraid I know no more than you do, Señor Palazon. The authorities are being very tight-lipped about their plans." Pasquala stirred then, her eyes focusing on Hartley with an intensity that made him take an involuntary step back. "Doesn't matter what they plan," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "The voice, Goblin, it's not finished with any of us." A chill ran down Hartley's spine at her words. Before he could respond, commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. Inspector Morales had arrived, his face grim as he made his way directly to Dr. Vega. Two men conferred in hushed tones, their expressions growing more serious by the moment. Finally, Vega turned to address the room once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid I have some disturbing news. Despite our best efforts to isolate the affected area, we have received reports of unusual occurrences in other parts of the city." A collective gasp rose from the assembled crowd. Hartley felt his heart race as the implications of Vega's words sank in. The Goblin, it seemed, was no longer confined to Gascon de Gotor Street. As the press center erupted into a frenzy of questions and speculations, Hartley found himself looking back at Pasquale. A young maid stood perfectly still, a small, enigmatic smile playing at the corners of her mouth. And in that moment, Hartley was struck by a chilling thought. What if the evacuation hadn't contained the phenomenon, but instead had set it free? The aftermath of the Zaragoza goblin incident was proving to be as mysterious and unsettling as the haunting itself. As news of the phenomenon's apparent spread filtered through the press center, theories began to fly thick and fast. Dr. Vega, besieged by questions from all sides, struggled to maintain order. Please, everyone, we must approach this scientifically. Jumping to conclusions without proper evidence will only hinder our investigation. But even as he spoke, Hartley could see the doubt in the scientist's eyes. The controlled evacuation, the cutting of communication lines, the establishment of a military cordon, all of these measures had been based on the assumption that the goblin was somehow tied to the physical location, Palazon's apartment. If that assumption was wrong, the phenomenon could indeed move or spread. Hartley shuddered at the implications. He turned back to Pasquale, intending to press her further on her cryptic statement, but the young maid had vanished into the crowd. As the day wore on, reports of strange occurrences throughout Zaragoza continued to trickle in. Disembodied laughter echoing through the halls of the university. Objects moving of their own accord in shop windows along the Coso. A voice, chillingly familiar to those who had heard it on Gascon de Gotor Street, whispering from the shadows of the Basilica del Pilar. Each new report added fuel to the fire of speculation. Theories ranged from the scientific to the supernatural, each more outlandish than the last. 1. Mass hysteria. Some experts argued that the stress of the initial haunting, combined with intense media coverage, had triggered a citywide psychological phenomenon. People were seeing and hearing things that weren't there, their minds primed to interpret any unusual occurrence as part of the goblin's activities. Number 2. Elaborate hoax. Skeptics insisted that the whole affair was an incredibly complex prank, perhaps orchestrated by a group with advanced technology and a flair for the dramatic. The spread of incidents, they argued, was simply the pranksters expanding their operation. 3. Geological phenomenon. A team of geologists proposed that unusual seismic activity could be causing low-frequency vibrations, explaining both the disembodied voices and the movement of objects. The recent incidents could be attributed to this activity spreading along underground fault lines. 4. Interdimensional breach. More esoteric theorists suggested that the goblin was actually a being from another dimension, and that its activities had somehow weakened the barriers between worlds. The new incidents were the result of this breach widening, allowing more otherworldly influence to seep through. 5. Government experiment gone wrong. Conspiracy theorists latched onto the idea that the whole affair was a secret government project, perhaps a new form of psychological warfare that had spiraled out of control. 6. Collective unconscious manifestation. Jungian psychologists proposed that the goblin was a manifestation of the city's collective unconscious, given form and power by the focused attention and belief of thousands of people. As these theories circulated, the mood in Zaragoza grew increasingly tense. The city that had initially treated the goblin as a curiosity, then a threat, now faced the possibility that the phenomenon was evolving into something far more pervasive and uncontrollable. Hartley, caught in the eye of this storm, found himself grappling with conflicting instincts. As a journalist, he was trained to seek out facts, to approach even the most outlandish stories with a degree of skepticism. But as a human being who had witnessed the inexplicable firsthand, couldn't shake the feeling that they were dealing with something that defied conventional explanation. Late that night, as he sat in his hotel room poring over his notes, Hartley was startled by a knock at the door. Opening it cautiously, he found Pasquale standing in the hallway, her eyes wide and haunted. "Mr. Hartley," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something. Something about the voice, about the goblin. I think I know what it wants." As Hartley ushered her into the room, closing the door behind them, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to hear something that would change everything. The story of the Zaragoza goblin, it seemed, was far from over. In fact, it might be just beginning. Chapter 9, Echoes Through Time. The revelation Pasquale shared with William Hartley that night would haunt him for years to come. Her words, spoken in a voice trembling with a mixture of fear and something akin to awe, painted a picture of an entity far more complex and terrifying than anyone had imagined. "It's not just a voice, Mr. Hartley," Pasquale had said, her eyes never quite meeting his. It's a key. Key to something ancient, something that's been sleeping beneath Zaragoza for centuries. And now it's awake, and it's hungry." In the days that followed, as Hartley grappled with whether to publish Pasquale's account, Zaragoza underwent a transformation. The once bustling city became a shadow of itself, streets eerily quiet as residents retreated indoors, fearful of what might be lurking around every corner. The construction of the new Edificio Duende, on the site of the original haunted apartment building, became a subject of intense debate. Some saw it as a defiant gesture, a refusal to be cowed by the unexplained. Others viewed it as a dangerous provocation, tempting fate by building on what they now considered cursed ground. As months turned into years, the Goblin of Zaragoza entered into local and international folklore. Books were written, documentaries filmed, and countless theories proposed. The city found itself forever changed, its identity now inextricably linked to the mysterious events that had unfolded on Gascon de Gotor Street. Tourism, somewhat paradoxically, boomed. Ghost tours of the city became wildly popular, guides regaling wide-eyed visitors with tales of the goblins' exploits. The Edificio Duende itself became a macabre attraction, its name a constant reminder of the forces that had once held the city in their thrall. For the Palazon family and the other former residents of the haunted building, life would never be the same. They found themselves forever marked by their experiences, their every word and action scrutinized by a public still hungry for answers. Pasquale Alcocer, once a simple maid, now found herself the reluctant center of attention. She retreated from public life, shunning interviews and refusing to speak further about her experiences. Rumors swirled about her. Some said she had gone mad, others that she had gained mysterious powers from her encounter with the goblin. William Hartley, torn between journalistic integrity and the weight of Pasquale's secret, ultimately chose not to publish her full account. Instead, he wrote a series of articles that hinted at deeper mysteries while respecting the young woman's privacy. His nuanced coverage earned him accolades, but the decision would nag at him for the rest of his career. As the years passed, interest in the Zaragoza goblin waxed and waned. New mysteries and phenomena captured the public's imagination, pushing the events of 1934 into the background. But for those who had lived through it, for those who had heard the voice and felt the chill of the unexplainable, the memory never faded. Paranormal researchers and skeptics alike continued to study the case, debating its significance and searching for clues that might finally explain what had really happened in that unremarkable apartment building. Each new theory, each new piece of evidence, reignited interest and sparked fresh debates. And through it all, Zaragoza itself stood as a silent witness. The city that had seen empires rise and fall, that had weathered wars and revolutions, now bore the invisible scars of its brush with the unknown. In quiet corners and shadowy alleyways, locals still spoke in hushed tones of the goblin, their words carrying echoes of a fear that had never quite dissipated. Decades later, as Pasquale Alcocer entered her twilight years, she granted a rare interview to a young journalist fascinated by the long-ago events. Age had softened her features, but her eyes still held a spark of the intensity Hartley had noted all those years ago. When asked about the source of the voice, about the true nature of the goblin that had so terrified and captivated the world, Pasquale was silent for a long moment. Then, with a small, enigmatic smile, she simply said, "From within the wall." Those 4 words, cryptic and tantalizingly vague, would reignite interest in the Zaragoza goblin, spawning new theories and investigations. But for Pasquale, they represented a final unburdening, a passing on of a secret she had carried for a lifetime. As night fell over Zaragoza, the city's lights twinkling like earthbound stars, the echo of a long-ago laugh seemed to dance on the wind. The Goblin of Zaragoza, whether real or imagined, had left an indelible mark on the city and on the world. Its legacy lived on in whispered stories, in academic debates, and in the collective memory of of a city forever changed by its brush with the unknown. And somewhere, perhaps in the foundations of the Edificio Duende, or in the ancient stones of the city's winding streets, or in the very air that hung over Zaragoza, something stirred. Waiting. Watching. Ready perhaps to once again make its presence known to a world that had never truly forgotten the terror and wonder of those fateful days in 1934. The story of the Zaragoza goblin, it seemed, was far from over. It had simply entered a new chapter, one that would continue to unfold in the hearts and minds of those who dared to listen, for that eerie, unforgettable laugh echoing through the corridors of time. Chapter 10. Unresolved Mystery. As the 21st century dawned, the events that had transpired in Zaragoza nearly 7 decades earlier still cast a long shadow over the city and the field of paranormal research. The Goblin of Zaragoza had become more than just a local legend. It was a touchstone in discussions about the nature of reality and the limits of human understanding. Dr. Elena Suarez, a respected parapsychologist and great-granddaughter of one of the original investigators, stood before a packed lecture hall at the University of Zaragoza. Her annual seminar on the Goblin incident had become one of the most popular courses on campus, drawing students and visitors from around the world. "What we must remember," she said, her voice carrying easily through the hushed room, "is that the Zaragoza Goblin case remains, to this day, fundamentally unsolved. Despite decades of research, countless theories, and advancements in technology that would have seemed like science fiction to the original witnesses, we are no closer to a definitive explanation." As she spoke, images flashed on the screen behind her. Photographs of the original apartment building, newspaper clippings from 1934, and more recent pictures of the Edificio Duende that now stood on the site. "Some of you may be wondering why we continue to study an event that occurred so long ago," Elena continued, her eyes scanning the audience. "The answer is simple. The Zaragoza Goblin incident challenges our very understanding of reality. It forces us to confront the possibility that there are aspects of our world, perhaps even other worlds, that exist beyond our current ability to perceive or comprehend." In the back of the hall, an elderly man listened intently, his gnarled hands clasped tightly in his lap. Few in the audience recognized him. This was Arturo Grijalba, once the young boy who had pleaded to leave the haunted building. Now in his 90s, Arturo had become a repository of first-hand knowledge about the incident, his memories undimmed by the passage of time. As the lecture continued, Elena delved into the various theories that had been proposed over the years, from the psychological to the paranormal to the extraterrestrial. Each had its merits, she explained, but none could fully account for all the observed phenomena. "Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the case," she said, her voice dropping slightly as if sharing a secret, "is its apparent resistance to resolution. Every time we think we're close to an answer, new questions arise. It's as if the mystery itself is alive, evolving, always staying one step ahead of our understanding." In the audience, a young journalist named Maria Cortez scribbled furiously in her notebook. As a native of Zaragoza, she had grown up with the legend of the Goblin. Hearing it discussed in such academic terms gave it a new dimension of reality. As the lecture drew to a close, Elena opened the floor for questions. Hands shot up across the auditorium, each person eager to contribute their own theory or seek clarification on some aspect of the case. One question, however, stood out. A middle-aged man with kind eyes and a gentle voice asked, "Dr. Suarez, given all we've learned over the years, what do you personally believe was behind the Zaragoza Goblin incident?" Elena was silent for a moment, weighing her words carefully. "What I believe," he said at last, "is that the Goblin incident reminds us of the vastness of our ignorance. It stands as a testament to the fact that, for all our scientific advancements, there are still mysteries in this world that defy easy categorization or explanation." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. "But more than that, I believe the Goblin of Zaragoza serves as a kind of mirror, reflecting our deepest fears and our most profound hopes. For some, it represents the terror of the unknown. For others, it's proof that there's more to existence than what we can see and touch." As the seminar concluded and the attendees filed out, Maria found herself walking alongside Arturo Grijalba. The old man moved slowly, leaning heavily on a cane, but his eyes were bright with an inner fire. "Signor Grijalba," Maria ventured, "may I ask you something? After all these years, what do you think about what happened?" Arturo stopped, turning to face her fully. "My dear," said, his voice quavering slightly with age, "I have spent a lifetime trying to answer that question, and do you know what I've concluded?" Maria shook her head, hanging on his every word. "That some mysteries are not meant to be solved," Arturo said softly. "They exist to remind us of the wonder and terror that still exist in the world. The goblin, whatever it was, showed us that reality is far stranger and more marvelous than we can imagine." As they parted ways, Maria found herself staring up at the Edificio Duende, its modern facade a stark contrast to the old buildings surrounding it. For a moment, she thought she heard a faint echo of laughter on the wind, playful yet somehow ominous. The Goblin of Zaragoza remained an enigma, a challenge to the rational world, and a reminder of the thin veil that separates the known from the unknown. Its legacy lived on in the stories passed down through generations, in the academic debates it continued to spark, and in the subtle undercurrent of unease it still ran through the city. As night fell over Zaragoza, lights flickered on in windows across the city. In homes and cafes, in university halls, and on street corners, people continued to discuss and debate the events of 1934. The goblin had become part of the city's identity, a shared experience that bound its citizens together across time. And somewhere, perhaps in the walls of the Edificio Duende, or in the collective unconscious of the city itself, something stirred. The mystery of the Zaragoza goblin remained unsolved, far from forgotten. It waited, patient and inscrutable, ready to capture the imagination of future generations, and remind them that in a world of science and reason, there was still room for wonder, fear, and for the delicious thrill of the unexplained. As Maria made her way home, Arturo's words echoed in her mind. Some mysteries, indeed, were not meant to be solved. And perhaps, she thought, that was the true legacy of the Goblin of Zaragoza. Not the fear it had instilled, but the questions it continued to ask, challenging each new generation to look beyond the veil of the ordinary and glimpse the extraordinary that might lie just out of sight. The story of the Zaragoza goblin was not over. In many ways, it was still being written, its narrative shaped by each person who encountered it. And in that ongoing tale lay the true power of the unsolved mystery, its ability to inspire, to terrify, and to remind us all of the vast, uncharted territories that still exist in our world and in our own mind. As the city settled into the quiet of the night, the laughter of the goblin seemed to linger in the air. Gentle reminder that some stories never truly end. They simply wait for the next chapter to unfold. Chapter 11. Conclusion. As Maria Cortez made her way through the winding streets of Zaragoza, the weight of history seemed to press in around her. The goblin's story had become intertwined with the very fabric of the city, thread in the tapestry of its identity that could not be unraveled. She found herself standing before the Edificio Duende, its modern facade a stark contrast to the ancient buildings surrounding it. As she gazed up at its windows, each one a potential portal to the unknown, she felt a chill run down her spine. Was it merely the cool night air, or something more? The words of Dr. Elena Suarez echoed in her mind. The goblin incident reminds us of the vastness of our ignorance. How true that was, Maria thought. In an age where humanity had mapped the human genome, explored the depths of the oceans, and sent probes to distant planets, the events that had transpired in this unremarkable apartment building still defied explanation. Perhaps, she mused, that was the point. Perhaps the true value of the Zaragoza goblin lay not in solving its mystery, but in the questions it continued to provoke. It served as a reminder that the world was still full of wonders and terrors beyond our understanding, that the boundary between the known and the unknown was more permeable than we liked to admit. As she turned to leave, Maria caught a glimpse of movement in one of the Edificio Duende's windows. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought she saw a face peering out at her. Not a human face, but something other, something that seemed to shift and change even as she looked at it. But when she blinked, it was gone, leaving her to wonder if it had been nothing more than a trick of the light and her own overactive imagination. The encounter, real or imagined, crystallized something in Maria's mind. She realized that the story of the Zaragoza goblin was far from over. It lived on not just in the memories of those who had experienced it firsthand, not just in the academic discussions and paranormal investigations, but in the impact it continued to have on each person who encountered its tale. For some, like Arturo Grijalba, it was a lifelong quest for understanding. For others, like Dr. Elena Suarez, it was a challenge to expand the boundaries of human knowledge. And for many of Zaragoza's citizens, it was simply a part of their heritage, a story passed down through generations that shaped their perception of the world. As Maria began the walk back to her apartment, she felt a sense of both unease and excitement. The goblin's story had touched something deep within her, awakening a curiosity about the unexplained that she knew would not easily be put to rest. She understood now why the case had captivated so many for so long. It was a mystery that defied easy answers, forced those who encountered it to confront the limits of their own understanding. In that moment, Maria made a decision. She would write about the goblin, not to solve its mystery, but to explore its impact. To delve into the ways it had shaped Zaragoza and its people, how it had influenced fields from psychology to physics, and how it continued to challenge our perceptions of reality. As she reached her building, Maria paused, looking back in the direction of the Edificio Duende. In the distance, she thought she heard the faint echo of laughter carried on the night breeze. It was impossible to tell if it was real or just a product of her imagination, and in that ambiguity lay the enduring power of the Zaragoza goblin. The story, she realized, was not just about a voice in the walls or inexplicable phenomena. It was about humanity's eternal struggle to make sense of a universe that often defied comprehension. It was about the tension between our desire for concrete answers and the allure of the mysterious. And perhaps most importantly, it was about the power of the unknown to inspire wonder, fuel creativity, and push the boundaries of what we believe to be possible. As Maria entered her apartment and sat down at her computer, fingers poised over the keyboard, she felt a sense of connection to all those who had grappled with the goblin's story before her. The terrified residents of Gascon de Gotor Street, the baffled investigators, the eager journalists, the skeptical scientists, and the wonder-struck tourists. Each had played a part in keeping the story alive, in ensuring that the questions it raised continued to resonate through the years. She began to type, her words flowing onto the screen. In the heart of Zaragoza, there is a building with a strange name and an even stranger history. It stands as a monument to a mystery that has endured for nearly a century, a reminder that even in our modern world of science and reason, there are still shadows where the unexplained lurks. This is the story of the Goblin of Zaragoza, a tale that begins with a laugh and ends with a question that echoes through time. What lies beyond the veil of our understanding? As Maria wrote deep into the night, the city slept around her, and somewhere, perhaps in the walls of the Edificio Duende, or in the collective imagination of all those who had ever wondered about its secrets, the presence that had come to be known as the goblin stirred. It had waited decades for the right moment, for the right person to come along and breathe new life into its story. Now, as the first light of dawn began to paint the sky, it seemed that time had come again. The mystery of the Zaragoza goblin was about to captivate a new generation, challenging them to look beyond the ordinary and consider the extraordinary possibilities that might lie just out of sight. In the end, the true power of the goblin's story lay not in its resolution, but in its ability to inspire wonder, provoke thought, and remind us all that the world is far stranger and more marvelous than we can imagine. And in that reminder lies the seeds of discovery, of innovation, and of a deeper understanding of our place in a universe that continues to surprise and astonish us. As Zaragoza awakened to a new day, the laughter of the goblin seemed to linger in the air, a gentle invitation to all who would listen. Come, explore the unknown, for in the space between what we know and what we have yet to discover, true magic awaits. The end.